On May 10, 2026, something happened that the United States Navy does not do casually, does not do accidentally, and does not do without careful calculation about who is watching, who is listening, and what message every word of the official announcement is designed to deliver. A United States Navy Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine surfaced at Gibraltar, and then the Navy issued an official public statement confirming it. Read that again, not because the submarine moved, submarines move. The entire operational doctrine of the American submarine fleet is built around movement, silent, undetected, unacknowledged, invisible movement through depths that no adversary surveillance system can reliably track. The Ohio-class boats are the most survivable component of the American nuclear triad precisely because nobody knows where they are. That invisibility is not incidental, it is the entire strategic value of the platform. A submarine that nobody can find cannot be targeted in a first strike. A submarine that cannot be targeted means that any adversary considering a first strike against the United States must calculate that somewhere in the ocean, at an unknown depth, on an unknown heading, carrying up to 24 Trident D5 submarine-launched ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, an Ohio-class boat is waiting for the order that the E-6B Mercury aircraft exists to deliver, so the Navy does not tell people where the submarines are, except when it does. Except when the specific strategic communication requires the adversary to know precisely where the submarine is and precisely what it is capable of, except when the message that the submarine's presence delivers is more valuable than the tactical surprise that its concealment provides, except when the President of the United States has just described a ceasefire as being on massive life support with a 1% chance of surviving, and the National Security Team has met to discuss resuming combat operations, and the administration is reportedly leaning toward taking military action to force concessions on a nuclear program that Iran agreed to dismantle 2 days before the announcement and then reversed that agreement before the ink was dry. That is when the Navy surfaces an Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine at Gibraltar and issues an official press release about it. Stay with me, because what happened on May 10th and May 11th is not a collection of parallel developments that can be analyzed in isolation. It is a precisely sequenced, deliberately timed, strategically coordinated signal directed at a specific audience, the Iranian regime's remaining decision-making structure, using every instrument of American power short of the actual use of force to communicate a message that the failed ceasefire negotiations, the rejected proposals, and the verbal expressions of presidential frustration have not succeeded in delivering. The message is not complex. It is not subtle. It does not require strategic interpretation. It is the Ohio-class submarine sitting at Gibraltar, capable of striking anywhere in Iran with weapons that no Iranian air defense system, not the surviving Majid point defense batteries, not the mobile electro-optical systems, not the Chinese upgraded passive infrared seekers can detect, intercept, or survive. Combined with the E-6B Mercury aircraft that arrived in Germany on the same day, the airborne command post specifically designed and specifically capable of ordering those submarine-launched missiles into flight, the signal is as unambiguous as the American military knows how to make it without crossing the threshold from signaling. Too striking. The question that the next 72 hours will begin to answer is whether the Iranian regime's remaining decision-making structure is capable of reading that signal accurately. To understand why there is genuine uncertainty about that question, you have to go back to the national security meeting that took place at the White House on May 11th. Senior officials gathered to assess the state of the ceasefire and discuss options for the path forward. The reporting from sources familiar with those discussions describes a president who is not venting frustration performatively. He is assessing options with the specific language of someone who has made a decision in principle and is now evaluating the specific parameters of execution. Two officials described Trump as leaning toward taking some form of military action against Iran to increase pressure on the regime and force concessions on its nuclear program. One official said the president intended to tune them up a bit. Another official's characterization was more blunt. I think we all know where this is going. That language, tune them up, deserves analytical attention. It is not the language of a decision to resume the full scope of Operation Epic Fury. It is the language of a targeted, escalatory application of military pressure designed to change a specific variable in the negotiating equation, not to destroy the remaining 25% of Iranian military targets that CENTCOM has identified but not yet struck, not to restart the comprehensive campaign that the ceasefire suspended. Something calibrated, something that increases the cost of continued intransigence without necessarily triggering the full escalation cascade that a comprehensive resumption of hostilities would produce. The distinction matters because calibrated pressure and comprehensive military resumption are different operational concepts with different diplomatic consequences and different alliance management requirements, and the Iranian regime's response to each is different. The 25% target figure is the number that defines the outer boundary of the option space. American military planners have identified a remaining set of Iranian military targets, approximately a quarter of the original comprehensive target list that the first phase of Operation Epic Fury has not yet struck. Some of these are hardened underground facilities, some are dispersed mobile assets that the ceasefire has allowed the URG to reposition into less accessible locations, some are command and control nodes, some are elements of the coastal missile battery infrastructure that survived the initial strike packages. The existence of that 25% figure in the reported discussions tells you several things simultaneously. It tells you that the military planning for a resumption of operations is not conceptual, it is specific. Target lists have been developed and reviewed. The identification of what has been struck and what has not been struck is precise enough to produce a percentage figure that the President can discuss with his national security team as a concrete operational parameter. The question being discussed in that meeting is not whether military options exist, it is which military option best serves the strategic objective at the current moment in the diplomatic trajectory. It also tells you something about the Iranian regime's calculus that is not sufficiently appreciated in the coverage of the negotiating dynamic. The URG's argument to its own institutional base, the commanders, the mid-level officers, the security force personnel whose continued loyalty keeps the institution operational has been that the system can absorb American military pressure without surrendering on the fundamental questions of nuclear capability and state sovereignty. That argument rests on the regime's ability to demonstrate that it is still a functioning military force with retained capability. Every additional target struck from that 25% list reduces the physical infrastructure that supports that argument. It is not just damage to assets, it is damage to the narrative that sustains the institutional loyalty the URG depends on for survival. The enriched uranium question is where the ceasefire's collapse is most revealing and most consequential. Trump's account of what happened is precise and verifiable in its structure if not in every detail. 2 days before the ceasefire proposal was delivered through Pakistani intermediaries, Iranian interlocutors indicated that Tehran would agree to the removal of enriched uranium from the country, the 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency has confirmed Iran is likely sitting on material that is a short technical step from weapons grade, that represents the most direct and most immediate pathway to the nuclear capability that the entire American strategic objective in this conflict is designed to permanently prevent. The agreement was indicated. Then 2 days later, when the formal proposal document arrived 4 days late, when it should have taken 10 minutes to produce, for a document that Trump described as simple enough to summarize in a sentence that agreement was absent, not modified, not conditioned, absent, the document that arrived. After 4 days of waiting did not include any agreement to remove the enriched uranium from Iranian territory. Iranian sources close to the negotiating team subsequently confirmed publicly that the response does not include any agreement to remove enriched uranium from the country, directly contradicting the private communication that had indicated agreement 2 days prior. The contradiction is not ambiguous. The Iranians said yes in private and no in writing. They agreed verbally to the one thing that would have made a deal possible and then failed to include that agreement in the formal document that is supposed to constitute an agreement. The gap between the private verbal indication and the formal written position is the gap that Trump described with the specific frustration of someone who has experienced this exact dynamic in business negotiations, the deal that gets made in the room and then unmade in the paperwork. This pattern is not new in the history of Iranian nuclear diplomacy. The architecture of Iranian negotiating behavior across every round of nuclear talks going back to the early 2000s includes the specific technique of indicating flexibility on key issues in informal communication while maintaining formal positions that exclude the flexibility that was informally indicated. The informal flexibility keeps talks alive and preserves the diplomatic track's appearance of progress. The formal rigidity ensures that the talks do not produce an agreement that constrains the nuclear program. The gap between the two is where every nuclear deal with Iran has gone to die, and it is where this ceasefire is currently located. Trump's characterization of the Iranian leadership as very dishonorable people is the public expression of a private operational conclusion that the negotiating partner on the other side of the Pakistani intermediary channel is not negotiating in good faith, is not capable of producing the formal commitment that informal communication suggests is possible, and is using the gap between informal indication and formal position to extract the maximum ceasefire duration without surrendering the nuclear program that the ceasefire is supposed to be a stepping stone toward constraining. The president has reached this conclusion after what he described as 4 or 5 rounds of engagement with Iranian counterparts who change their minds, who agree in principle and then fail to produce the agreement in writing, and who send documents that arrive 4 days late and exclude the provisions that made the exchange worth having. The URG's own response to the ceasefire's deterioration confirms the analysis of an institution that is using the diplomatic window to prepare for resumed conflict rather than to produce a genuine negotiated resolution. Kalibaf, one of the most significant remaining power figures in the Iranian state structure, issued a statement that combined a threat with a tactical warning. Our armed forces are ready to deliver a well-deserved response to any aggression, and they will be surprised. The second sentence is the more operationally significant one. They will be surprised. That is not generic defiance rhetoric. It is the specific communication of a military institution that has used the ceasefire to implement changes in its defensive posture, repositioning assets, enhancing capabilities, preparing responses that it believes are not yet fully visible to American intelligence collection. The surprise is the operational preparation that the ceasefire window has enabled. What is that preparation? The reports are consistent and the direction is clear. Iran is digging out its missiles. It is extracting ballistic missile systems from underground storage sites and hardened bunkers, moving them to dispersed positions that make comprehensive targeting more difficult. It is preparing drone stockpiles that survive the first phase for redeployment. It is positioning the assets that it was not able to protect in the first phase because they were where they were expected to be, in fixed facilities that the strike packages targeted in locations that the F-35 sensor collection over the Gulf of Oman and the RQ for Global Hawk persistent surveillance are now attempting to map. The competition between the ERG's redeployment of assets and the American ISR architecture's ability to locate those redeployed assets is the specific intelligence race that will determine how complete a target list the next phase of operations can execute against. The Ohio-class submarine is relevant to this competition in a way that is distinct from its role as a nuclear signal. The Ohio-class boats that carry conventional Tomahawk cruise missiles, the conversion program that modified some Ohio-class boats to carry up to 154 Tomahawks rather than ballistic missiles, provide a strike capability whose specific attributes change the ERG's defensive calculus in important ways. A Tomahawk launched from a submarine in the Gulf of Oman or the Red Sea does not produce the launch signature that allows Iranian radar systems to characterize the inbound weapon's origin, flight path, and intended target until the weapon is already deep into its terminal phase. The combination of submarine-launched cruise missiles with aircraft-delivered precision munitions and the hypersonic Dark Eagle system that has been requested for theater deployment creates a strike architecture whose constituent elements arrive from different directions, at different speeds, with different launch signatures, and on timelines that compress the Iranian response window to near zero. The Israeli government's reported preference for a special forces operation to secure Iran's enriched uranium stockpile before it can be moved, concealed, or weaponized is the option that sits at the most operationally risky and diplomatically consequential end of the option spectrum. Trump's reported hesitation about this option is analytically sound. Special forces operations to secure nuclear material in a hostile country are extraordinarily complex, extraordinarily dangerous, and produce consequences that are difficult to contain within the operational concept if something goes wrong. But the existence of this option in the reported discussions and the Israeli government's advocacy for it tells you something about how seriously the nuclear dimension of this crisis is being treated at the highest levels of decision-making. The 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium is not an abstraction. It is a physical stockpile. It can be moved. It can be concealed in locations that American and Israeli intelligence have not mapped. It can be transferred to a facility or a location that makes its removal or destruction in a subsequent strike significantly more difficult or impossible. The value of securing it before the window closes is obvious. The operational risk of attempting to secure it is the constraint that Trump identified as the reason for hesitation. The E-6B Mercury aircraft in Germany is not a coincidence in this context. The E-6B is the Airborne Nuclear Command and Control Platform, the aircraft that maintains communication with submerged Ohio-class submarines when ground-based command facilities are unavailable or have been destroyed, and that carries the authority to transmit emergency action messages ordering the launch of submarine-launched ballistic missiles if the National Command Authority makes that decision. The fact that an E-6B arrived in Germany on the same day that the Ohio-class submarine surfaced at Gibraltar, and that both events were made publicly known, is the deliberate co-deployment of the signal and the signaling infrastructure to ensure that the Iranian regime and every other government watching understands that the communication architecture required to order the submarine's weapons into flight is in position and operational. This does not mean nuclear weapons are being contemplated for use against Iran. The analysis here is not apocalyptic. What the co-deployment means is that the American signaling operation is using the full spectrum of nuclear deterrence infrastructure, the submarine, the communications aircraft, the official public acknowledgments to communicate to an Iranian regime that has been treating American red lines as negotiable, that the instruments of American power extend well beyond the carrier strike groups and the blockade and the air campaign. The message is the architecture. The architecture says every option is available, every capability is in position, and the decision about which capability to employ depends entirely on what the Iranian regime produces in the next round of decisions about the nuclear program and the straight. Trump's description of the ceasefire as on massive life support with the doctor walking in and giving a 1% chance of living is not rhetorical hyperbole. It is the president's public assessment of a diplomatic situation that his private national security team discussions are simultaneously characterizing as pointing toward military action. The gap between the public characterization and the private discussion is essentially zero. 1% chance of surviving is not a prediction that the ceasefire survives. It is a premortem, the explanation of a death that has already been decided and whose announcement is being managed for timing and framing purposes. The Iranian leadership's response to this environment is split in the specific and dangerous way that institutions under maximum existential pressure always split. The political figures, the president, the foreign minister, the parliamentary leadership are producing the signals of continued diplomatic engagement because diplomatic engagement preserves the ceasefire that preserves the regime's ability to keep digging out missiles and repositioning assets and preparing for the conflict resumption that the URG commanders want. Kalibaf, who sits at the intersection of the political and military power structures, is producing the specific threat language that signals URG preparedness while maintaining enough deniability that it can be characterized as defensive rather than provocative. The URG Aerospace Forces commander has stated that missiles are locked on targets and awaiting the order to fire. The Iranian regular army, the Artesh, is processing the experience of having been sent to front lines with 10 bullets per soldier as cannon fodder while the URG preserved its own assets. These different signals from different parts of the Iranian state apparatus are not contradictory. They are the simultaneous operation of different institutional actors pursuing different institutional survival strategies within the same collapsing regime structure. The URG wants to fight because fighting preserves its institutional relevance and its monopoly on the narrative of resistance. The political class wants to negotiate because negotiating preserves the possibility of an outcome that doesn't end with the URG's institutional destruction. The Artesh is watching both of them and calculating which faction's bet on the future is more likely to pay off for the regular army soldiers who have been sacrificed without adequate resources while the URG hoarded what remained. The supreme leader Mojtaba Khamenei, installed in the rushed, coerced process that multiple sources described as an URG-pressured assembly of experts vote conducted under conditions that 8 members publicly stated they would boycott, is communicating only through intermediaries, reportedly still managing the injuries sustained in the strike that killed his father and installed him in his current position. The nominal apex of the Iranian power structure is absent from the public stage at precisely the moment when visible supreme authority would do more than anything else to stabilize the institutional chaos that is producing contradictory signals from every layer of the government. Into this fractured, decentralized, institutionally incoherent decision-making environment, the United States has now introduced an Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine at Gibraltar with its location officially confirmed, an E-6B Mercury communications aircraft in Germany, a president who has described the ceasefire as having a 1% chance of survival, a national security team meeting that has produced leaks describing the president as leaning toward military action, and a confirmed discussion of options including resuming Project Freedom, striking the remaining 25% of identified targets, and the most complex and highest risk option of a special forces operation to secure the enriched uranium stockpile. The calculation that the Iranian regime needs to produce correctly in this environment is the one it has consistently failed to produce correctly throughout this conflict. It needs to assess whether the signals it is receiving represent genuine American intent or negotiating posture. It needs to assess whether the submarine at Gibraltar is a bluff or a commitment. It needs to assess whether the president who described the ceasefire as on life support is signaling the opening of a new negotiating bid or announcing the decision to end the ceasefire that has already been made. It needs to assess these things in an environment where its intelligence capabilities have been degraded, where its command structure is fragmented along factional lines, where its supreme leader is communicating through intermediaries, and where the 40-day oil storage clock is running simultaneously with every other pressure on its decision-making process. The oil clock is still the organizing constraint. The storage tanks at Karg Island do not respond to signaling. They do not pause for the surfacing of a submarine or the arrival of an E-6B aircraft. They fill at the rate that production exceeds export capacity, and that rate has been elevated since the blockade closed the export channels. The 40-day window is approximately 38 days from today. Every day that passes without a resolution that restores some form of oil export capacity is a day closer to the forced production shutdown that the Iranian oil ministry official described to the New York Times. Well, closures potentially permanent after that point, infrastructure damage that no engineering team can reverse quickly or cheaply. The URG's bet is that resuming military conflict during the 40-day window produces the concession pressure that diplomatic stalling has not produced, that the spectacle of Iranian missiles striking American positions and Gulf state infrastructure forces the economic calculation to change in Washington before the oil infrastructure damage becomes irreversible. This is the institutional bet of an organization that has run every other option and concluded that this is the one remaining play. Demonstrate enough military capability to impose costs that change the American calculus before the well shutdowns begin, while using the uranium stockpile as the ultimate insurance policy that forces some form of engagement regardless of what happens on the battlefield. The problem with this bet is the same problem that has produced every previous miscalculation in the history of URG military doctrine. It assumes that the American political will to absorb costs and continue as the limiting constraint. It has been the limiting constraint in every previous confrontation. It may not be the limiting constraint when an Ohio-class submarine has surfaced at Gibraltar, when the E-6B is in Germany, when the president has described the ceasefire as having a 1% chance of survival, when a national security team meeting has produced reporting that describes a president leaning toward military action, and when the French aircraft carrier is transiting toward the strait with stated freedom of navigation intentions. The French dimension of this picture deserves more analytical weight than it is currently receiving. The arrival of the FS Charles de Gaulle into the operational environment near the strait at this specific moment as the ceasefire talks collapse, as the submarine surfaces at Gibraltar, as the national security meeting produces reporting about resumed operations is not the coincidence it might appear. France's decision to deploy a carrier group to this operational environment required weeks of political authorization and military planning. The timing of that deployment coinciding with the ceasefire's documented collapse, the submarine surfacing, and the national security team meeting is the timing of an intelligence-driven assessment that the next phase of this conflict is approaching rapidly and that the French military's presence in the relevant operational area during that phase serves French strategic interests. Whether those interests are aligned with American objectives or represent a French calculation that being present during the next phase preserves Paris's ability to shape the outcome is a question that the operational record of the next weeks will answer. But the carrier is transiting. It is not arriving late. It is arriving on the schedule its deployment planning produced, and that schedule was built on an assessment of where the conflict trajectory was going that the current week's events have confirmed. The American laser system for counter-drone warfare early fielding, not full deployment, but on timeline for the region matters in this operational context because the ERG's retained asymmetric offensive capability is primarily its SHOD drone stockpile and its remaining ballistic missile inventory. The SHOD swarm is the tool. The economics of the swarm depend on the cost asymmetry between the drone and the interceptor. A laser that reloads at the speed of electricity and costs less than $1 per shot removes the economic logic of the swarm entirely. If that system reaches theater operational status before or concurrent with any ERG decision to execute its offensive doctrine, the swarm tactic that the ERG has been positioning as its primary remaining instrument becomes an instrument that costs the regime everything it deploys and costs the American defensive architecture essentially nothing to defeat. The targeting picture that the F-35 sensor collection is building over the Iranian coastline mapping the repositioned fast attack boats, the concealed missile batteries, the dispersed SHOD storage facilities is the targeting database for the operation that the submarine at Gibraltar, the E-6B in Germany, the national security team meeting, and the president's 1% survival characterization of the ceasefire all point toward the intelligence competition between the ERG's dispersal effort and the American surveillance architecture's mapping effort is the race that determines how complete that targeting database is when the decision is made to use it. The enriched uranium status as the non-negotiable American objective, the specific item that Iran agreed to surrender 2 days before the proposal and then excluded from the proposal document is the variable that the Israeli government's preference for a special forces operation is designed to address directly, the concern that the intelligence community and the operational planning community share about the uranium is straightforward. Once resumed military operations begin, or once the Iranian regime's deterioration reaches a threshold that suggests institutional collapse is imminent, the 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium becomes an asset that every faction in the ERG's internal power struggle has an incentive to control, conceal, move, and potentially transfer to a location or a party whose possession of it creates the leverage the regime was unable to create through negotiation. The window for securing that material under American or Allied control is precisely the window that exists before either of those scenarios materializes. After the window closes, the problem becomes categorically more difficult. Trump's description of the pilots who carried out the strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, their extraordinary skill, the no-moon darkness they operated in, the precision with which every bomb found its target in the granite mountain is both a tribute to the aircrews and a strategic message. He said only China and the United States have the equipment capable of retrieving material from those facilities. He said the Iranians are unable to get the material even if they wanted to. He framed that assessment as a reason not to take a chance to ensure that the material status is confirmed and verified through the mechanism of formal agreement rather than operational assumption. The deal that he described as being agreed to 2 days before the proposal and then absent from the proposal is the deal that would formalize what the strikes may have physically achieved. The Iranian reversal of that 2-day-old agreement is the specific act that makes the formal verification impossible and that makes the operational alternatives more attractive to decision-makers who believe that assumptions without formal verification are not assumptions that can be maintained indefinitely, the national security team. That sat with the president on May 11th. Vance, Witkoff, Rubio, Hegseth, Dan Kane, CIA Director Ratcliffe is not a team assembled for diplomatic deliberation. It is a team assembled for decision-making about military options in a context where the diplomatic track has produced a proposal that Trump did not finish reading, a uranium reversal, and a ceasefire that the president has characterized as having a 1% chance of survival. The specific composition of that meeting, combining the national security principles with the intelligence community leadership, is the composition of a meeting that is evaluating intelligence-based targeting assessments alongside policy options. The reporting that describes Trump as leaning toward military action is the output of a meeting whose agenda included a discussion of how to move forward with Iran that has arrived at a direction. The submarine is at Gibraltar. Its location is confirmed by official Navy press release. The E-6B is in Germany. Its arrival was officially noted. The national security team has met and discussed military options, including striking the remaining 25% of identified targets. The president has described the ceasefire as on life support at 1% chance of survival. The Iranian regime has confirmed it will not agree to remove enriched uranium from the country. The IRG's leadership has issued statements saying their forces are ready to fight and that American forces will be surprised, and the 40-day oil storage clock continues its physics-driven countdown regardless of what any human actor decides to say or not say about it. The question that sits at the center of every analysis of this situation is the question that cannot be answered from the outside of the decision rooms that produced the submarine surfacing, the E-6B deployment, and the national security meeting. Is this the signal immediately preceding the decision, or is this the signal that is intended to produce a last-moment Iranian calculation change that avoids the need for the decision? Both interpretations are consistent with the visible evidence. An administration that has decided to resume operations has every incentive to maximize the signaling pressure in the days immediately preceding those operations to ensure that when operations begin, the diplomatic record shows that every possible opportunity for the adversary to change course was provided. An administration that has not yet made the final decision but is leaning toward it uses exactly the same signaling architecture to produce the pressure that might make the decision unnecessary from the Iranian regime's perspective. This distinction is existential. Getting it wrong in one direction means accepting terms under coercive pressure that the IRG has declared it will not accept. Getting it wrong in the other direction means discovering that the submarine at Gibraltar and the E-6B in Germany and the president's 1% characterization of the ceasefire were not the final warning, but the actual final warning when the next signal is not an Ohio-class boat surfacing at a NATO port but a strike package already airborne toward the remaining 25% of identified targets. The 40-day clock does not wait for this calculation to be made correctly. The oil is in the tanks, the wells are still producing, the tanks are filling, the IRG is digging out its missiles and repositioning its fast attack boats and telling its domestic audience that it will fight and they will be surprised. The submarine is at Gibraltar. The E-6B is in Germany. The president has said 1%. The national security team has met. The reporting says Trump is leaning toward military action. The French carrier is transiting toward the strait. The laser system is being fielded. The F-35s are over the coast collecting targeting data. And in Tehran, the regime that agreed to surrender its enriched uranium 2 days before the proposal and then excluded that agreement from the proposal is processing all of this information with a command structure whose supreme leader is communicating through intermediaries from an undisclosed location and whose different factions are simultaneously signaling willingness to negotiate and readiness to fight, which is the specific combination of signals that an institution produces when it has not yet decided which of those two paths it is actually on. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the moment when that calculation resolves, when the regime either produces the agreement that the uranium reversal made impossible or when the decision to resume operations that the national security team meeting approached produces its visible operational expression, that moment is not theoretical. It is on the timeline that the 40-day oil clock and the 1% ceasefire characterization and the surface submarine at Gibraltar are all counting down towards simultaneously. Drop your prediction in the comments. Do you believe the submarine at Gibraltar changes the Iranian calculation in time, or has the gap between what the IRG can accept and what American strategic objectives require already made the next phase inevitable? This is World Brief Live. The submarine is surfaced. The clock is running. Stay informed. Stay ahead.